Hi everyone, and welcome back to our first micro lecture of the module. Today we're going to turn our attention to opioid-based drugs and the many dangers that these drugs pose to us. As you're probably aware, we're in the midst of an opioid crisis in this country. The use of opioids is not a new phenomenon, as we know from previous discussions, but we are reaching a critical point in which our opioid use is becoming extreme, significant, and dangerous to millions of users every year. In this lecture, we're going to first discuss the different types of opioids available and end with a discussion of governmental efforts to stop this crisis. Let's go ahead and get started on today's discussion. Before we get into the different types of opioids that are available, you may have heard the term narcotics being associated with these drugs at times. Narcotics or opioids are any type of substance that is derived either naturally or synthetically from the opium poppy. There are a number of different drugs that come from the opium poppy besides pure opium. They include morphine, heroin, methadone, oxycodone, hydrocodone, codeine, and fentanyl. There are a variety of other synthetic opioids that have been developed but are lesser known than these more popular ones. Fentanyl, for example, has several analog varieties which aren't often picked up in a drug test as specialized testing is required. U47700 is an emerging fentanyl analog that is picking up traction in the U.S. Carfentanil is one of the most potent fentanyl analogs currently available in the U.S. and is thought to be 10,000 times more potent than morphine. There are several different types of poppy plants out there, but only some will give you opium. The others will not. Poppy seeds, like those in breads and bagels, do contain small amounts of opium and have a morphine-like effect, but it is very subtle. This is not enough to be concerning and not enough that you would actually feel anything. But if you do eat enough of them, then you might not pass a drug test. That's not a myth. You can make poppy seed tea out of them if you soak the poppy seeds long enough. You need to soak a couple pounds of them and then drink quite a bit of the tea to achieve a therapeutic effect. There have been cases of individuals failing their drug test if they eat enough of the poppy seeds over time. So if you know that you're going to be drug tested sooner rather than later, maybe lay off the bagels. Let's talk a little bit more about the opium poppy itself. Where does the opium poppy have its roots? What part of the world do we see the majority of it being grown? Opium poppies have their roots in Asian and Middle Eastern countries. But the biggest country that we historically associate with the opium poppy is China. We often credit the Chinese culture with the influx of opium-based drugs into the U.S. As we discussed in previous lectures, Chinese immigrants who came to the U.S. through the West Coast ports were credited with the mass introduction of opium to the country. After the Civil War, we saw many veteran soldiers using morphine at high rates to deal with their war wounds and to treat the mental health effects of fighting in battle. There were also a number of Southern women who used morphine to help cope with the after effects of the war. But for the Chinese immigrants, they were smoking pure opium. The derivative drugs like morphine and heroin were developed as mainly painkillers and anesthetics for medical patients, which quickly became abused by those addicted to the drugs. This is a picture of an opium poppy about to be harvested. You have to make cuts up the side of the poppy seed pod, and you will then get a liquid that starts to seep out. A harvester has to let it drain for a little while and then starts to scoop it out. The white liquid is pure opium. As opium is exposed to air, it starts to dry. When it dries, it changes colors and goes from white to this red-brown sort of color. This is called Opium Gun due to its texture and consistency. This is a picture of an opium harvester who is collecting opium that has been released from the poppy. They will then take the gum and allow it to dry out even more. A calcium solution and hot water is added to the opium gum, is then stirred, and then you got to let it sit for a little while longer. Once it sits for a while, the compound starts to separate, and you get a clear liquid that sits on the top. That's the morphine that will later be refined for medical purposes. Once you siphon all of that liquid out, you have to add a binding chemical to the mix, which requires heat to do the binding. After you heat it up, the liquid turns to a solid for the most part. You need to drain any remnants of the liquid from the residue and then let it dry in the sun. Break it all apart and you will have a brown morphine base. You then need to add even more chemicals to it, and the morphine base will turn black in color. Cool it down and filter it with water to remove the impurities. This is sodium carbonate. You have to add water to this, mix it with your morphine base that was just created, and now you're going to have a heroin base. This is a picture of the heroin base. Charcoal and even more water was added. Then you have to filter out the majority of the charcoal to remove those impurities. You then let this mixture dry out. This is considered black tar heroin. Once the charcoal is filtered and the mixture is dry, you add some remaining chemicals that help to break up the heroin mixture into a more powdered consistency. Then filter it one more time. Your final result is dry, powdered heroin, ready to be cooked, snorted, smoked, or injected. As you can tell, this is a complicated process and not one that can easily be done unless you know what you're doing. The production of heroin substantially increased following World War II, but it really took off in the U.S. following the return of Vietnam veterans who returned home having used the drug while overseas. The Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia has become the center of a thriving opium economy and a crucial source of narcotics for the world. The current oversupply has led to warehousing of huge quantities of opium, making the heroin problem in the area intractable and spreading heroin epidemics possible. The Golden Triangle includes parts of Burma, China, Laos, and Thailand. It provides ideal conditions for opium cultivation, which began during the 16th and 17th centuries. As I mentioned before, the Vietnam War helped to transform the area and the opium economy into one of the largest and most profitable drug economies in the world. Although efforts were made to eliminate the opium poppy population as early as 1964, those efforts didn't seem to have much of an effect on the production of heroin in the area. With the U.S. withdrawal from Saigon in 1973, so did the U.S. efforts to help curtail the heroin economy in the region. This withdrawal allowed the heroin economy to flourish, given that the region has perfect weather conducive to growing opium poppies. In addition to the Golden Triangle's production of heroin, a secondary hotspot, considered the Golden Crescent, also became a significant producer of heroin. Overtaking the Golden Triangle in terms of production, the Golden Crescent covers Central, South, and West Asia, including the mountainous areas of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. Myanmar was the world's leader in opium and heroin production up until 1991, when Afghanistan took over in terms of production. The heroin production in Afghanistan took a hit when the U.S. invaded in 2001. During that year, 90% less opium was produced in the region than in the year before. However, the industry rebounded, and by 2007, Afghanistan produced 8,000 of the world's 9,000 total tons of opium that is produced in the world. The product is then trafficked into Iran for distribution. This is going to bring us to the end of our first micro lecture for the module. In the next session, we are going to continue our discussion of heroin as this industry interacts with prescription opioids in the U.S. We will also discuss the growth of synthetic opioids and how law enforcement officials are working to combat the import of fentanyl into our country.